So the hype for Visions of Mana is not exactly where I think it should be. And I suppose that it's dawning on me now that not everybody is as familiar with this series, as it's one of those very Japan first or Japan facing franchises, much like Star Ocean, which we've talked about extensively on this channel. You know, where the fandom is here in the West, but it is nowhere near the same level of strength that it is in the East. So the launch of a brand new mainline entry for the first time in 17 years, and just how important that is or big that is, might be lost on some gamers. Not to mention that there's already 18 games in this franchise, so what's the big deal if there's another one added, right? I'll explain the difference between all of them in a full retrospective of the series. I really want to talk about this and explain why it's a big deal, and, you know, honestly, I'm kind of wondering why you haven't pre-ordered it yet. It's $60 US, it drops on August 29th for PS4, PS5, PC, Xbox Series X and S. Leave me tapped up in the background as I whisper sweet musings into your ear holes about the wonder of the Mana games from the background. Go on, get that credit card out. And while you're doing that, by the way, if you like nuanced discussions on gaming, consider subscribing. And hit the like button to let YouTube know it too. So, we covered the release date, the platforms, and the price. But what is Visions of Mana? It's the fifth mainline title in a series of action RPGs that are very largely popular in Japan with a considerable following abroad. It follows the journey of a group of magical alms and their guardian Val, who is the main character, on a pilgrimage to rejuvenate the mana tree, which is something that's a central figurehead in all of the games. The gameplay features exploration of like big open areas and very action-based battles, and then there's elemental powers being used in both combat and in the exploration. The series is quickly identifiable by the whimsical and high fantasy art style in nearly all of the games. It's colorful, you kind of know it when you're looking at it. It would be ridiculous for me not to mention this, but one of the things that the series is absolutely known for is the combat, particularly the multiple classes and weapon class systems that a lot of the games have. They tend to have a lot of options, whether you're fighting with spears, swords, wands, whatever. There's a lot of class options, a lot of variety to how you perform combat. The series is kind of niche in the States, but is extremely beloved in Japan, striking major chords of nostalgia with a lot of people. One of the biggest things that holds me back from playing games in a storied franchise like this is the fear that I'm not gonna know something, or I'm missing references when they're presented to me, or Easter eggs, or even cameos. So I'll go ahead and let you know now, there's no connected story at all. Much like Final Fantasy, they're all completely disconnected, self-contained stories, and even the ones that do connect, it's very loosely and has no impact on the direct plot, or very little. So let's cover some series staples so you do know what to look for. So, as I mentioned before, the mana tree. It's something that is present in all of the games, and it's usually where the source of magic comes from in the entire world. That tree has died, been destroyed, been restored, and so much over time. It's just changed. The mythos of the tree is different in every single story, but it is the mana tree. It is always there. The only thing that really changes is the varying degrees of relevance to the plot and or the ending. Then there's the mana sword. It's a sacred sword that usually rests beneath or near the tree and is usually involved in protecting or rejuvenating the tree. It's pretty much a seed of the mana tree itself. Much like the mana tree, it's a plot device that is unwaveringly part of the mana mythos. Then there's the mana goddess. She's taken many forms over the course of the games, but they usually coincide with like the spirit of the tree. It's without a doubt that the Mana Goddess will be brought up in Visions of Mana. I wouldn't be surprised if one of the characters ends up becoming the next Mana Goddess. That's just how the Mana games go. Then there's the Elementals. They're present even in the demo, but they're sometimes characters with dialogue and personalities of their own. You know, personally, I'm a big fan of Salamando. That's my boy. That's my favorite. They provide the main characters, at least in Visions, with the ability to manipulate elements and control them at their will, which you'll use in exploration and in combat. So also the monsters and creatures, they're all staples too. They've been the same ones, a lot of them, over the course of years. The Rabbites, they're the little bunny creatures that have no arms or legs and have a little puffy tail. They're the little bunny creatures that you'll find in like the early parts of the games, and sometimes that they're actually super bosses. But they're kind of like a themed creature for the series, kind of like slimes for Dragon Quest or chocobos for Final Fantasy. There's also mushbooms, there's a little cactus, Flammy, which is the species of mana beast created by the moon gods, and Flammy is sometimes your transport in the games as like an aerial mount, or sometimes it's just Flammy's just brought up as part of mythos of the world. There's been a couple of badass cutscenes, at least from Dawn of Mana, with Flammy, but Flammy is actually a species of dragon, not one particular dragon. And then there's, you know, characters that reoccur too, like Niccolo, the swindler bunny bitch. I hate this fucking bunny. He's an asshole. Vuskov, the badass bird turtle. You know, he's gonna be your water transport at some point in Visions. I'm positive I've already seen him. There's so much more. So just keep in mind that some of these creatures that you're gonna hear names of and see throughout your playtime in Visions, they've probably been in other games too. But let's cover the timeline and the history of the Mana series. Like I said, there's 18 games. So first we're going to cover the mainline games, and then we'll go in and fill in all of the remakes and spin-offs in between. So the first mainline game was a Game Boy release known in Japan as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden, known over here as Final Fantasy Adventure. It came to us in 1991. This title has actually gotten a couple of remakes, and we're going to touch on those later. The game was praised for its innovation and its free action combat at the time, and it had some similarity to the Zelda games. It had a decent sales flow, which then allowed them to create the sequel title, Secret of Mana, for the Super Nintendo in 1993. This was made alongside some of the greatest Super Nintendo games ever made, like Final Fantasy IV and Chrono Trigger. Actually, at one point during the development cycle, this game was intended to be both of them, but it ended up remaining its own thing. One of the great things about the Secret of Mana release on SNES is that it had a multiplayer aspect where player 2 could take control of one of the characters on screen. This actually does come up in other games where they try to revive this. I really wish Visions of Mana got it. The most notable part of this game that has actually persisted through nearly all of the follow-up titles is the command ring system that's part of the UI. I do have to say, by the way, it feels a little strangely implemented in Visions, like it's not needed anymore. I don't love it, but it still works. The next mainline title to be released was Trials of Mana for the SNES. This was released in 1995, but North America didn't see this one until 2019 in a collection re-release, which we're going to talk about that later in the video. The game was called Trials for a few reasons. One, the creator wanted the number 3 involved since it was the third game, thus the prefix try. 2, you could only recruit 3 of the 6 protagonists in a single playthrough. And then 3, of course, the trials that they would endure throughout the game. But of course, over in Japan, it was just called Seiken Densetsu 3. The next game in the mainline series was Dawn of Mana in 2006/2007, depending on where you lived in the world. This was one of the World of Mana titles, which was a project that was aimed at growing and revitalizing the Mana brand via a shotgun of different game types. This, however, did not work out well for them, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Now, it's worth mentioning again that the Mana games mostly do not have a direct connection, save for a few spin-off titles, But if they did, this would definitely be the first of them in a chronological sense, Dawn of Mana. This game was not received well, despite having quite a bit of Kingdom Hearts energy in it. You know, as popular as that game was, this one, it sacrificed a lot of the RPG aspects that people had come to know and associate with the Mana series, and leaned more into the action and combat. If I'm being honest with myself, I think this is probably my favorite game in the franchise, at least until Visions comes out, but this was the series' first foray into a fully 3D world. And then, of course, if you include the upcoming Visions of Mana, this covers the mainline titles. However, there's also many spin-off titles and remakes, like I said, so let's quickly dive into each one of them and fill in the gaps in the timeline. 4 years after Trials of Mana in 1999, Legend of Mana was released on the PS1. This had a plot centered around an unnamed hero who tries to restore the world and the mana tree after its destruction. It too is an action RPG with a very strange world builder mechanic that is kind of an interesting take on an open world. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this one, but for whatever reason, it's very, very beloved by the Mana community. I think one thing that's great about this is the lack of direction and how insanely lost you get while playing it. It actually enhances the experience. This is actually one of the few games where using a guide inherently ruins the playthrough. And maybe that's why they like it so much. 4 years later, in 2003, Sword of Mana was released on the Game Boy Advance, which is the first remake title that comes up in this list. It's a remake of the first game, Final Fantasy Adventure, albeit with some major changes to the original game. It's definitely been more manified, I guess. It falls more in line with the rest of the series and like the art style and the scope. They even made like a full-fledged character out of the heroine instead of her just kind of following you and being a heal bot. So now you get 2 playable characters. The next title is Children of Mana, released in 2006 on the Nintendo DS. This is one of the World of Mana titles. Children of Mana is more of a dungeon crawler and action-oriented RPG, bringing multiplayer back into the mix, a la Secret of Mana. And it had a plot centered around 4 heroes combating an invasion while learning about the events that nearly destroyed their world 10 years prior. This is one of the few titles that is actually connected to another Mana game. This is set 10 years after the events of Dawn of Mana. Friends of Mana also came along in 2006, and yes, this was another World of Mana release, a mobile game that was never released to the US. Not a whole lot is known about this game on the internet, other than it was mobile, it was an action game, and it was allegedly set 10 years after Legend of Mana. I couldn't imagine playing this kind of game on a flip phone, and I had one back then. The game lasted 5 years before being shut down in 2011. Heroes of Mana came along in 2007 on the DS, another World of Mana release. This time trying for a real-time strategy adventure. And this had a plot centered around a young soldier defending several nations from his own country. The last connected game in the Mana series, Heroes, is actually set 10 years prior to Trials of Mana. An interesting take on the IP, using the monsters of the franchise to battle in strategic combat as opposed to it just being, you know, a little bit more action-adventure-y hack and slash. But this game did not review or sell well at all. Another World of Mana flop. You know, there's something to be said about the failure in bastardizing what your franchise is known for in a shotgun blast of half-baked games. I can definitely say that the lesson was learned. And 2008 brings us yet another remake of Final Fantasy Adventure, except this time it's for mobile phones. I don't really know why this one got so much love compared to the others, but it really did. This one is nearly identical to the original release on Game Boy in functionality, but it has better color, sprite work, and sound. The only real intentional changes were some item names, but this was because they had less limitations on space. One thing that apparently didn't translate well was the controls, seeing as the O-ring on cell phones back then was nowhere near as comfortable or responsive as controllers. There really isn't much else to say on this one. It's a better version, but the definitive version had yet to come. The next game didn't come until 2013, which was Circle of Mana. Circle of Mana was released on mobile, a card-based RPG circling a loose plot that saw heroes seek the mana sword to defend the mana tree from imminent threats. Seemingly pretty basic and only released in Japan. This game lasted for 2 years before being retired in 2015. I gotta say, while I obviously did not get the chance to play this, I don't like what I see. In 2014, Rise of Mana came to mobile and Vita, and this is a period that you can clearly see where Mana was really being pushed into the mobile market. So Rise of Mana was an action RPG that was free to play, and it had 8-player co-op. This was a relatively successful mobile launch, with the advent of more powerful phones coming out and being in the public's hands. It amassed 500,000 players within the first few days. However, management issues and shifting priorities within Square Enix would lead this project to being abandoned in less than a year's time, as this was deemed no longer a profitable concern. Along came Adventures of Mana in 2016 for mobile and then later PS Vita. Yet another remake for Final Fantasy Adventure, the first game in the series. However, this version seemed to borrow from both Sword of Mana and Final Fantasy Adventure alike. Like in Final Fantasy Adventure, there was only one character, the male, that was a playable character, but the battle system, UI, and the sword attack were taken from Sword of Mana rather than the original. It might actually be safe that this is the definitive version of the first game in the series. Then in 2017, the Collection of Mana was released, and that contained the first 3 main titles in the series, and that was directly to Nintendo Switch. So that was Final Fantasy Adventure, Secret of Mana, and Trials of Mana. However, this wasn't really a particularly big deal to us in the West until we got it in 2019, when it was finally translated and released in Western markets. This was a big deal because it was the first time that Trials of Mana was available officially for English consumption. A big deal, since the fandom could really only rely on fan translations for the first 24 years of Trials' existence. Continuing with the revival of classics, in 2018, Secret of Mana, what I consider to be the crown jewel of the Mana series, got a full 3D remake on PS4, PC, and Vita. Seeing this game getting the full 3D remake treatment was exciting. However, it was not met with the best reception. There were a handful of issues that people were not happy with, like the lack of hit detection and companion AI performance. But all of these things existed and were maybe arguably worse in the original. I guess people just kind of expected a fix. I will personally say that my only gripe is there wasn't really enough of a difference between the two versions, similar to how I felt about the Mario RPG remake. The original still stands to the test of time. Completing the circle of remakes, Trials of Mana got the full 3D remake treatment as well for PS4, Vita, and PC in 2020. This game is definitely one of the highlights of the series, particularly the remake. I will say though, the dub is horrifically bad, the dub for the dialogue. Honestly though, the game is so fun that it's kind of easy to look past it. Sort of. Kinda. It's really, really bad. But having this game with like a full 3D world and flying on Flammy and surfing on Vuskov and, extremely challenging on higher difficulties, it's the Mana enthusiast's wet dream. And the last thing to add to this list is Echoes of Mana, their most recent expansion into the mobile market, which only happened in 2022. This was the first new game in the series in 8 years, as every game that came in between was a remake or a port. This was an action RPG, but also an MMO and a gacha game, which turned me off of it immediately. One of the only online Mana games that existed outside of Japan, and it was met with user praise and a decent reception. but the game ceased operation only 1 year into its life cycle. The developer notes indicate that difficulties managing the game probably contributed to the decision to close service, but I think there was a big push back then with Square Enix to kind of close a lot of mobile games pretty quickly, and I don't really know the reasoning behind that. But a lot of games died well ahead of the time that they should have, if you ask me. And that's the full timeline of the releases of the Mana games. If you watch this far, I only assume at this point that you are a mega fan of the Mana games, or you're very, very extremely curious about this niche game series. I do hope that this sheds some light on the franchise as a whole and helps to illuminate the rich history of the Mana series as you dive into Visions of Mana. I'm promoting this game like they're paying me to. So the big reason that this is such a big deal is the fact that it's a mainline Mana game. There is a stark difference between the mainline Mana games and then all of the spin-offs that we have listed. It's not a remake, it's just Visions of Mana almost feels like a swan song for the Mana series as a whole, and I hope that that's not the case. I want this to be the beginning of a revitalization. This is that game that we've been waiting for, a single-player, large-scale RPG adventure. This is something that got the proper respect that this series deserves. I don't want this series to fade into obscurity even more than it already has. That's why this is a big deal. Sure, there's a billion titles, but I promise you, this is the first one that's come along in 18 years that is a dedicated single-player adventure meant to tell a story and not necessarily recoup nostalgia money or bleed into the online gacha market. This is what we have wanted for a very long time, and that's why there are pockets of the internet who are just beyond hyped for Visions of Mana. I believe in it, I guess. I don't know why the niche JRPGs tend to speak out to me the way that they do, but they just kind of suck me in sometimes. The Mana series and its accompanying art style has always been put on like a pedestal in my head, especially Secret of Mana. I truly believe that this is one of the best JRPG franchises out there. At least the high quality titles are, right? The ones that really had the polish put on them. They really stand out. The high fantasy art style, the light-hearted storytelling, the dark themes found within, that refined combat and gameplay first approach, all of it is exactly what I look for in a game. It speaks to me as a Star Ocean fan. It's hard to put the controller down when you pick up a Mana game. This series will always have a special place in my heart. This was a lot of work and a lot of research. If you think I did an okay job giving some history on the Mana series, or if you enjoyed the video at all, please give it a little thumbs up and subscribe to join the Turtle Kingdom if you haven't already. I promise you there is more Mana content coming. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon, and long live the Turtle Kingdom.